Thank you, Greg and Leo. I appreciate your introduction and your heart and passion for the ministry of Christ, and for the help technologically here of getting the mouse in the right direction. I want to share the screen here so we can get our slides going for you. Begin our slideshow here. There we go. Super. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking time out this afternoon from your busy schedules to be a part of this equipping series. Thank you to the family leader for their willingness and understanding to be able to understand the need for mental health conversations within the context of the faith community, within the context of the church itself. A little bit about what we do at Team Restoration Ministries. We are a ministry that's been around since 2006. It was a vision that God gave to me, one of those moments in which clearly audibly heard God speaking, saying, son, this is where you're headed next, get ready and prepare. And our desire and design at Team Restoration Ministries from God was to partner with local churches, partner with Christian counselors, and bridge those two entities together so that we can provide Christian counseling through the venue of the local church back to the community. And today that's what we're doing across the state in many different localities. It originally started with myself and 4 churches. And God decided he was going to expand that to something greater and bigger across the state of Iowa, which we're blessed to be a part of. Our mission is, again, to provide a safe place, Christ-centered, Christ-based counseling services through the venue of the church, and let that church be able to utilize and advertise to the community that they have Christian counseling in their church without that being a burden to needing to hire for church staff. Or the worries of what it means to bring a counselor on the payrolls of the church itself. You can see our ministry website there. I encourage you, invite you to go check that out and explore that. You'll see our faith statement. You'll see many other things there. Referral telephone numbers is there, as well as opportunities for where you can engage with different churches and therapists around the state of Iowa. As we get into this program today, I just want to say a big thank you to each of you who are showing a desire to better understand mental health just by your attendance to this webinar today. And I believe it's incredibly important for the church today to understand the notion of mental health and how it's impacting the communities in which the church is trying to reach and reach out to and engage as well. A fact, this is 2015 data, so a little old. I would suggest to you that we may have even an increase in prevalence today, but a fairly still significant data here of 43.8 million adults experiencing mental health in a given year within the United States. That's a large number of U.S. citizens. 1 in 5 adults in America experience some sort of a mental health illness over the course of their lifetime. Nearly 1 in 25, that's about 10 million adults in America today, live with a serious mental illness. This is indicative of our church populations and our Christian community as well. The church community is not absent of these statistics, and so I believe it's incredibly important for pastors, for church leadership to understand what it means for those in our congregations, those in our community to be living with mental illness or mental health conditions. And then finally, I would say to you, 1/2 of the chronic mental illnesses begin at the age of 14, which at the age of 24, that's about 3/4 of them by the age of 24. When you look across the bottom of this slide and you see the prevalence, I share this with you so you can get an understanding of what kinds of illnesses we might be talking about and percentage-wise within America that we're talking about. As we look at schizophrenia, today about 2.4 million U.S. citizens or U.S. Americans live with schizophrenia. When you look at bipolar disorder, you'll see 6.1 million or 2.6%, and you can see the percentages as they go up. But I want to take us all the way to the end there, the 18.1%, and the anxiety disorder. 42 million Americans report as living with some sort of an anxiety disorder. Anxiety disorders can play themselves out in many different ways, but from a mental health perspective, what we know about is that anxiety and depression oftentimes go hand in hand, and one will feed the other over time. And so those who start with anxiety oftentimes will evolve into other mental health illnesses or issues, and it's paramount or key for us to be able to step in that anxiety raising time. And oftentimes the situations may start out with situational anxiety, and they develop into something much more significant towards a chronic sort of anxiety. I want to share on this screen with you for just a brief moment here, and I don't want to get too biologically oriented or too medically oriented, but I think that this screen and this picture is really impressive in describing what it looks like for mental health issues with the human brain. Across the top of each one of these columns is the normal human brain, and you can see the blue, you can see the yellow, you can see that what that normal brain looks like as a cross section. When you then impose onto it certain diagnoses, depression, OCD, bipolar OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, bipolar and anxiety, you can then begin to see what that brain cross section looks like, and the heated areas, if you will, are those red areas that increase and take over the capacity, especially of the yellow parts of that brain. And so these are brain scans and what brains look like with certain mental health disorders. And I oftentimes use this slide to help skeptics understand that mental health disorders are real. Just as if we were to go in and do an X-ray or a CAT scan of the lung looking for a tumor for some sort of lung cancer, we would see a difference between a normal lung function and a diseased lung function. That's what you're seeing here today as it relates to the brain and mental health disorders. The brain is an organ, and helping others understand that we don't neglect the heart by not taking our heart medication, or we don't neglect the battle for battling cancer by not taking what the doctor suggests to us could get us in sort of some sort of remission for cancer. I would suggest we shouldn't disregard the brain's need and for the opportunities to help it heal. Let's look at some key points to consider for most of the rest of this program, and we're going to talk about these key areas. What are our limitations as pastors, as church folks, maybe ministry leaders within the church, why we might refer, when do we refer, to whom do we refer, and then how do we make that happen and go about making that referral. And please understand, while I'm talking to you from the context of the work that Team Restoration Ministry does across the state, I want you also to understand that there are many, many, many other great Christian providers in your communities, for some of you, that you can apply this conversation to around referrals and when one might refer to a Christian therapist. Let's talk first of all here for a bit about understanding our limitations. And folks, limitations come with all of us, no matter what profession we're in, no matter what God's called us to do or be a part of. And in any of those ministries, we have to understand where those limitations are at. And I want to suggest to you a passage from Romans 12:3. For through the grace given to me, I say to every man among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but instead to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith. I believe that particular reference or that passage has incredible impact on this conversation around where our limitations are at. Not just in when to refer, but our limitations in general when we talk about ministry. A whole different conversation that I often have with folks in our line of work, as well as with pastors, is around boundary and compassion fatigue and how we keep ourselves healthy. Let me suggest to you that if we don't know our limitations, we will find ourselves in that burnout stage, and we can certainly have conversation about that in another forum at another time. But as we think about burnout, as we think about knowing our limitations, and as we think about Paul's guidance here, some conversation I think we need to have is what it means to be one body with many members. In other words, I believe the scripture says to us is that we all are gifted in different ways, and when that one body, the church, comes together using all of our gifts and talents, many are blessed. Many can have sound judgment. Many can find healing. So I would suggest to you, as one body with many members, pastors, lay leaders, those of you listening in today, we have to remember in this conversation around limitations is that God has blessed us as leaders with certain skill sets. Doesn't mean we have to carry the burden to know everything and do everything. So knowing our limitations and where that they begin and end. Also understanding that we are not expected to know everything as an individual. From the perspective of Christ, I don't believe he expects any one of us to know it all. That's why he went to the cross, was so that we could have that redemption and that saving grace. And in this passage in Romans, Paul says to us, through the grace given to me, I say to every man among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought. And I would suggest to us that if we are on that white horse syndrome mentality, we may find ourselves thinking much higher and have much greater expectations and find ourselves thinking more highly of ourselves than what maybe Christ would like to see us. And that humility conversation begins to play out there as well. And then finally in this conversation, we all have gifts, as I've alluded to, and it could be perceived or it could be seen as when we don't allow others in the body to express their gifts, what are we robbing them of in what Christ is asking them to do in service and opportunities to serve others? So remaining honest, remaining ethical, and remaining legal are all three key areas in which I think we want to think about when we talk about our limitation. And when an individual, a parishioner, comes into us as pastors, we want to make sure that that individual knows what we are able to do or not able to do, and we're not crossing the boundaries in our professional roles and staying ethical within the context of our work as pastors and our work as therapists, and ultimately making sure that we're not bridging or stepping over any legal areas to be concerned about. Let's think for a little bit about why we might consider a referral. So it's important to consider making sure that when we refer or when we make a decision not to refer, that we are either availing ourselves or suggesting someone else that is the most competent in being able to deal with what is sitting before us. And so a couple of those questions that I would encourage you to ask and think about is, what qualifies me as the pastor to sit in this arena or this area dealing with the issue that has been presented to us or to me? And the second question to ask yourself in those moments when you're thinking about whether or not to refer is, what is my training and my background? What have I been equipped with to be able to apply to the issue that is sitting before me that this person is expressing? I'm well aware that many, many pastors do super jobs at counseling, especially as around a relationship and marriage, especially around premarital counseling, or what I like to call pre-engagement. I wish we could get people into pre-engagement counseling before that engagement ever happens. And oftentimes individual counseling, pastors are very well equipped to do that. What I hear from pastors time and time again is when it moves to that notion of a mental health diagnosis, a mental health condition, or a more severe issue, that's when I experience or hear pastors say to me, whoa, wait, how do I get the help I need for this individual? Because we have now gone into an area that I'm not comfortable, qualified, or don't feel I have the training in. So two key questions to ask: what qualifies you to be in that area with that person? And then what training have you had to apply to the issue? I would also suggest then on this notion of when to refer, of making sure that we are in a very ethical and an environment in which we have boundaries in place, that we're making sure that our ministerial relationship with that counselee is not jeopardized by us walking into that counseling relationship with them. A couple of areas that, as my work has unfolded with pastors and churches across the state and across the Midwest, that I often hear, or comments that I hear, is that there are times when people will leave the church because the church staff may have helped them incredibly well through a crisis, but that parishioner now feels that the church knows too much about my junk, too much about my stuff, too much about my pain, my marriage, too much about some of the secrets that I've had, and their ability to be able to sit in worship now is hampered on Sunday morning or in small group because of that fear. The second area that I've heard pastors question or ask or talk about is, will the counseling cause church members to feel like they need to leave because they're feeling too vulnerable, too exposed to remain in the church? Similar to that first statement that I just made, but a little bit different twist in that vulnerability now, if not handled well and dealt with well as counseling unfolds with a pastor or a church parishioner or a lay leader, that vulnerability can become a fairly large battle for that counselee, that patient as we call them, to overcome. And they'll find themselves isolating, stepping out of the small, this is typically how it happens. They isolate by stepping out of small group. They isolate by stepping out of children's ministry where they might be working on Sunday mornings. They isolate by no longer serving as a greeter at the front doors or as an usher. And they begin to find themselves stepping back into the recesses of the church, until which point they end up not attending church any longer. Again, I'm not saying that effective, well, good, strong counseling can't happen between the pastor and a church member. What I'm simply doing is raising the questions of why we might want to refer in situations where referral could need to take place. Let's turn our attention for just a little bit here to when do we refer, and spend some time thinking about, again, that notion of let's figure out when to pick up that telephone and ask the question, or to ask a therapist to engage, or even suggesting to that person sitting before us, well, you may want to think about now stepping into professional counseling. Also understand that I realize that some pastors are also professional counselors. We have dual roles in some of our capacities in our work. One of the key things that I encourage pastors to look at is what their job description says and expects of them if they are a professional counselor and a professional pastor. And where does that relationship start and stop according to what the church leadership expects out of your role as a pastor and out of your role as a therapist or a counselor? So this notion of when do we refer? Again, when your lack of experience or training doesn't match the needs of those sitting in front of you, that's a clear indication that we need to find somebody else to step in on this walk. Please also understand, though, when that referral is made, most therapists are not expecting that the pastor is going to exit. In other words, we would preferably, I would hope and desire to see that pastor continue to walk alongside of that church member in a capacity of a spiritual direction and guidance, in capacity of how is counseling, their spiritual walk, and the church all working together. So it's not a situation where we hand the baton and say, here, go see a counselor and don't come back and see me. It works best when we can work in a collegial relationship for the best outcomes for this particular person. One might also think about referring when there's a dual relationship. In the counseling world, we talk about dual relationships all the time. This is a key area that we as therapists have to be very certain that we monitor and watch and make sure that we're not, as a therapist, holding a power position, that we're not somehow in multiple relationships with those who are coming in to see us. And in saying that, in small rural communities, folks, you all understand how that dual relationship can be very difficult to navigate. So somebody coming to see me in a small rural town, it's my hometown, if that's the case, it may be someone who works in the school system that when I walk through that school door to have lunch with one of my children, I'm now going to see them in the capacity sitting behind that desk. And now we've got a relationship, a dual relationship. The key thing for us as therapists is that we recognize them, we name them, and we help define them so that we know where they exist and how we can best minimize that and protect the patient themselves or that parishioner themselves. I would say that's no different from you all when you're in the midst of counseling. Here are some nevers in my mind. Again, there may be some gray area in some therapists' minds, but these are areas in which I would say you as pastors would want to consider referring almost 100% of the time. In the counseling world, we don't counsel close friends. That's mixing way too many roles there, and that power position and friendship could be jeopardized quickly. We don't counsel family members. When I say family members, certainly we don't counsel brothers and sisters and their spouses. But I take that even further to nieces and nephews, to second uncles and aunts, twice removed, however you want to look at it. If there is a direct lineage or some sort of a family tie that's within 4 or 5 generations, I'm very careful to make sure that I don't bring them into my counseling room, and I would caution pastors as well. Just because there is a family history there that you all as pastors may know about from that person sitting in front of you that could jeopardize, that could cause some fears of what are you going to go back and tell the family at the next family reunion if I sit in your office and share my deepest, darkest feelings. And then finally, I would also encourage pastors to be very, very careful around how they engage other church staff or employees. And when one of those church member employees come to you and say, I need to sit down and I need to divulge some stuff to you, that relationship between employer, supervisor, pastor, and counselor can get really, really muddy very, very quickly. So I encourage pastors to refer all staff members out of the church for their counseling. And then finally, as you look at any sort of a situation where you have, and it's not on the screen, but where you have maybe some of your leadership around the eldership table, be very careful also in that role, because in some, depending on what your church body makeup as it relates to leadership and expectations of chain of command, you could find yourselves now interacting or counseling someone that you report to or who's in charge of your performance review or your next raise. There's just a lot of things that could be difficult there to discuss or to deal And then the third big bullet point or major bullet point on this slide of when to refer is when there's the pastor or that lay leader is feeling like they no longer are helpful in the counseling relationship. And this is where pride can get in the way, not just with pastors, but with counselors or with professional counselors who also want to help, but now they're meddling in an area in which they, again, haven't been trained or don't have the expertise, and they choose to continue to offer services when they may not be the most helpful or the right fit or the most equipped. And I've listed some areas underneath of this that I oftentimes hear pastors talk about as areas in which they find themselves wanting to refer, or at least thinking that they need to think about a referral. When we talk about suicidal and homicidal situations, not the fact that you all can't journey through that very difficult situation with families, where it sometimes turns grayer for pastors that I've heard is when it becomes now a grief situation that becomes very complicated. So we're going more than a month or 2 or 3 or 4. And in suicidal or homicidal situations, the grief process for that can be years. Certainly a year, 2 years, 3 years, but it can be a very long process with what that looks like. There are times also when grief gets complicated because it bumps into other recent experiences of losses, and that complicated grief can turn into anxiety to depression, can also manifest itself in other mental health behaviors as well. A second area, unable to manage one's life or no longer effective at home or on the job. I would say that when you as a pastor are starting to feel overwhelmed by the amount of referrals coming into you that are requiring your attention as a counselor, and you're not able to at home or effectively feel that you can be at home or on the job without that overtaking, I would say there may be a balance a situation or an issue with balance going on there of your roles. So when it becomes heavy, that's a red flag. Addictions, that's a very specialized area of work that therapists are trained in and do. So thinking about when that drug addict or alcoholic comes before you, when those who come before you with gambling addictions, or in the church today, one of the biggest issues that I see us pushing against and really trying to work through is pornography or sexual addictions. Those are incredible addictions to work through, and it takes a long time oftentimes to be able to battle those. It's not just, let's say, a prayer and those are going to go away. What I can tell you today is that in my line of work, I ask every male patient that comes into my office that's of the appropriate age. And so I tend to see 11, 12-year-olds and all the way up to the oldest old. One of my introduction questions in learning is, where is sexual addiction or pornography at in your life? Christian, non-Christian, pastor, not a pastor, doesn't matter who's sitting in front of me. That's a question that I ask. And I can say to you today that probably 95% of the men who are sitting in my counseling room will answer that somewhere there's been an impact. Either as a child, it's currently going on, or they've had a battle somewhere along the way. So that addiction piece is an area that's highly specialized that you may want to be very careful how far you go into helping that addict, depending on what's the situation. And then if the thinking is confused or sluggish or irrational in that person sitting before you, those are indications that there may be some other mental health things going on as well. So you may want to, or even learning disabilities that could be going on. So there could be some other opportunities for some referrals. And then finally, I really encourage pastors to think very clearly before they walk into the conversation around sexual dysfunction issues. Be certain that you understand how those issues come about, what they're centered in, and it oftentimes ties back to the notion of pornography or some of those addictions sexually that are going on in that person's life. And the reason I highlight that one for you is because when a pastor is talking to a parishioner around sexual related issues, those are very, or a therapist for that matter, those are very difficult conversations that take a lot of boundaries around them. And I always encourage pastors to make sure you're not talking about those issues with the opposite sex, especially without the opposite sex's spouse sitting in the room with you, because those are where the slippery slope really can happen for pastors and for counselors. So when do I refer? I've got a whole list of things here again to have you look at. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is more of a slide for you to take away and put in your binder, put on the back of your door, put at your desk. So when you're in those moments of that self-check, see if it hits any one of these. But a couple of them that I do want to highlight for you is that The second one, this is what I hear from pastors all the time that are getting overwhelmed in their role. And it's oftentimes because they're leading congregation members in which the congregation has seen them as the helper, has seen them as the advisor, has seen them as the counselor, and they're finding their schedule getting overtaken by counseling. So what I encourage pastors to think about is how you set up a policy within your church and your staff, not just for you, but for the whole staff, of how will we engage people in therapy. Many churches today and pastors today, lead pastors will say to me, they expect that they will see someone 3 times. And after that 3rd time, if they haven't been able to resolve the issues, that's an indication that a referral needs to be made outside the church to a professional therapist. Now, is there any research or literature that I can show you that says 3 times for a pastor and this is the right time to refer? Absolutely not. I was just with a pastor last week who said to me, I see everybody 1 time. And after that, if we can't deal with what needs to be dealt with the 1 time, I refer them on out just because my schedule is so full and there's a lot of expectation in my schedule. The most important part of that conversation is that your eldership and the church staff all know how to proceed with that. The slippery slope with this is when you have a pastor on your staff who is choosing to do counseling. It's oftentimes the family pastor. It can also be the youth pastor working with youth, and they find themselves 7, 8, 10, 12, 15, 14 times seeing an individual for counseling. That raises concern in my mind. I would also say that it's important to know where your referrals are at, where your areas in your communities or the neighboring communities where there are Christian counseling presence already that you can refer to. So in order to arm yourself so that you're ready to refer, you got to know where to refer. And if you haven't done the work to know where that's at, please go out and see what's in your communities around you that you trust. Go meet that therapist, ask to take them to lunch, ask them to come to your office to sit down with you, because one of the pastor's greatest fears is to refer somebody to a Christian counselor and have that not work, or have that therapist not be a Christian and get improper, unbiblical advice. And so get to know who you're referring to. That's one of the benefits of the work that we do, is that our therapists are on site. They get to know the pastors. They sit in that church. They have the opportunity to be able to engage with pastors in conversations, and they become much more comfortable. For the sake of time and opportunity for questions, I don't want us to run out of time. I'm going to jump down to the 3rd from the bottom, the difficulty maintaining confidentiality. This is perhaps one of the most concerning pieces that I see today when there is counseling going on within the context of the church and the church staff, is the need and understanding for the protection of the patient or the client's confidentiality, emotion, boundaries, you name it. I think that at times in the church, when we hear certain stories, when we hear certain engagements, when we hear someone who says, if I could just get more involved in the church, I would have more friends, I could feel better, all in best intentions. We go out and we try and help them figure out how to do that. In the therapeutic room, it's a little bit different than that. We may hear all of those issues, but we empower the patient, the client, to go out and build those relationships. We help explore what they would be and give them a plan, help create a plan with them that they go out and they build, rather than us doing that for them. I think at times when church members come to see a pastor, there's some expectation that that pastor is actually going to help walk them into those things. In doing that, there is the opportunity to violate one's confidentiality, and not intentionally, but it can happen so quickly and so easily. And so making sure that we understand what that notion of confidentiality is and how we maintain that when we're trying to help somebody. And that's another reason in which pastors choose to refer, so they can stay that neutral party and not find themselves in that conflict. So the question of who do I refer to, or how do I refer? Again, our telephone number is there. If we're in your area of the state, you can go to our website and be able to see where we're actually located across the state of Iowa. And we are always open to God's guidance in new church partnerships, as well as in new Christian therapist partnerships, bridging those together. So we go on God's guidance as we look at those sorts of things. And we do have some areas of the state that we are going to be opening up some new locations that aren't on our website yet. So our website is ever changing as we add folks into the mix. Let's talk a little bit about, though, when you refer to, typically this is a protocol that every therapist follows, that when you give a referral to one of your church members, telephone number. I think you should call this therapist at X organization, and here's the telephone number to call them at. This is how it typically works. They will call, and whatever mechanism that therapist office has for answering the phones, whether it's a receptionist, whether it's a voicemail, and if they're solo practitioners, it's oftentimes a voicemail, sometimes an answering service. That initial appointment will get established. Some organizations today are going to establishing 3 initial appointments right out of the gates. Our organization doesn't do that. We establish 1 appointment, let that patient come in, meet the therapist, determine if it's going to be a good mix and if we can help them and get that established. The next piece that will happen is in that first session, when they come to sit down, it's going to be some paperwork, much like going to the doctor, that is completed, confidentiality forms, the ability to bill insurance if that's what's going to be billed, the payment conversation, as well as all the confidentiality expectations and forms will be signed. And then in my office, what typically happens, and this is pretty standard for many therapists, is that we'll introduce ourselves as a therapist so the individual feels comfortable with us. They get to ask questions about us if they want to, and then we let the individual introduce themselves to us, and then we move right on into that. And what it usually looks like for me is I want to know what makes them tick. I want to know what gets them up in the morning. I want to know what it is that allows them to find hope. And then I'll have a series of questions I walk through, and then I turn it right over to them and just say, so why the telephone call? Why did you call me? Why did you decide that you wanted to come into counseling? And that really begins that process then of what the subsequent sessions are going to look like, starting to put together a treatment plan that allows us to methodically step through and work through what that patient or client hopes that they will receive from therapy. My perspective of it, again, this is just one man speaking here as a therapist, is that, and I share this with my patients, you've hired me to come alongside of you to help you to get to an end goal of healing. And in my mind, there are 3 domains to every human being: the mind, the body, and the spirit. And I believe all 3 of those domains must be dealt with, must be working in relationship with one another for full healing to come forth. Now, it's not abnormal for someone to come in and see us in a church. Mind you, they have to walk through a church door. They may walk under 2 or 3 crosses on their way to see me wherever my location is at in that church building, and have them not be a Christian. Or I've had atheists come into church, or have them say to me that their faith is minimal in their healing process in their mind. And again, I'm not going to push or hit anybody over the head with the scripture and the Bible if that's not what they want, but they will know that they're coming to see a Christian counselor, and I'm going to be doing what I'm doing and the work I'm doing because of my call and what Christ has asked me to do, and they will be biblical principles that we're going to be working on and dealing with and encouraging with. And so that really sets the stage for what subsequent sessions will look like going forth as directed by that patient and the therapist working together. There may be, in some situations, in those subsequent sessions where pastors will enter the room if that's something that's important for the patient, or if there's some need or reason for that to take place. I have on occasion had pastors attend sessions with the patient as a part of the process. So I want to suggest you this list or these items for you as pastors after you refer, and to make sure that you don't, again, once you've referred, make it a situation where the baton has been passed and you back off and disappear into the recesses. That's not helpful. What I think is helpful for both the therapist as well as for the patient sitting in that therapist's office is that you, as the pastor, the referral source, check in with that person from time to time and ask how they're doing. Is counseling working? Is it effective? Are you making a connection with the therapist I've referred you to? And if you hear back from them that no, they're not, but they're continuing to go to therapy, something's not working there. And there's opportunity to empower that person to go back to their therapist and say what's not working, why it's not working, what they wish was different. And you have a dynamic role as a pastor to be able to encourage that patient to go back, not to run, not to flee, because many times these individuals have been running throughout life. And if they run out of that therapist's office without closing the door effectively, it's only one more opportunity that they have in life to run. So your engagement with them is really powerful as they settle in and become comfortable with what's going on in that room. Protecting their confidentiality, we've talked a lot about that already, but it's key for you as you have referred them out. If they come back and they're sharing with you some of the things they're learning or some of the some of the things that they have processed, that stays as protected information between you and them, just as it does with a therapist and them. There are all kinds of confidentiality laws, HIPAA laws that govern this that you could certainly understand and read more about. And then be available to the counselee and the therapist if the counselee and the therapist should determine that it's important for a pastoral presence role in their work or their healing. I would finally say perhaps the most important, and this maybe should have been the first bullet point of the whole program, is that if you will continue to be in prayer for those that you refer out, I can't tell you how amazing it is and how many times I can point back to a pastor who I know has been on his knees for someone who's coming into my office in that hour. I feel it in my office, the patient feels it in my office, and the outcomes as we all work together are amazing when we all are asking for the Spirit's presence in that process. Referring appropriately, many of these things we've talked about in some way, but I do want to suggest to you that referring appropriately, the second bullet point here, does not in any way hinder your call as a pastor, in my opinion. It is suggesting instead that there are multiple people on the team here, and how can we get the best engaged people all working together with the best gifts that we all have for the healing of this individual that you're referring out. It also works to minimize codependency. Again, another conversation for another day, but codependency happens so quickly in our churches and in our counseling room, and so I'd love to have conversation around codependency and boundaries at another time. And then finally, I would suggest it also becomes a reflection, and we become a role model when we are able to say, when we have the maturity to say, we need to find someone else to help with this issue, when we need to bring somebody else who's gifted in this area to come in and walk alongside of you. That role modeling for that patient says, in my mind, that I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to have it all. I don't have to know everything. Let's open it up for questions as we have time here. We do have a few minutes, so we'll look forward to hearing what some of those questions might be. All right, so it looks like we have the first question here. We've had this happen. People were really helped, but now feel like they need a fresh start because someone they see regularly knows their struggle. We have this happen also. So it looks like this is coming from some of you. You're absolutely correct. And sometimes what that fresh start can mean is that we need to think about how we allow those individuals to exit or find a new church home or a new small group. It may not be as big as we need to go and find a new church. It could be something smaller. We need to find a new way to plug into the church, or we need to find a new small group to be a part of. In the event that it's in relationship to how that person is feeling related to the church and the pastor, because maybe the pastor knows too many things for that person to feel comfortable, we need to be able to release them in grace. What I can tell you is that the way in which the church can harm people the greatest who are hurting is when we don't release people in grace. And that means finding opportunities for them to engage in potentially other church bodies or other programming. The second question I see here is, how can a church partner with Team Restoration Ministries? Multiple ways. If you're interested in knowing more about that, would encourage you to contact us through our website. You can also contact the family leader here, as they will have our information as well. And we can look at what exists in your community. One of the ways in which we want to partner with communities is to never come in and take over. And if there's effective Christian counseling going on in your community, we want to help you find that, bridge that, and make that happen. But we want to be available to help in however that can look. So give us a call. What does the relationship between the patient's pastor and their therapist look like in an ideal situation? Excellent question. In my mind, in an ideal situation is that the pastor is not pushing for that relationship to exist, but that the patient or client is asking for that to exist. As a therapist, what you all need to know is that if the pastor is motivating that and wants that, but the client doesn't, we are not able to engage you within the context of that counseling relationship because it has to be motivated by the patient. We would then evaluate as the therapist, looking through whether that is the right thing or not the right thing for that plan of treatment, if it's the best process, and then what would be the benefits of having someone else come in from the outside to journey in that. Once it was determined that was all a go, the patient themselves would sign releases that would allow us to be able to talk to the pastor, and we would then invite them into that conversation. Actually, what I tend to do is ask the patient to go invite the pastor in once they've signed the releases. Again, putting that back for and empowering the patient to go make that request rather than the therapist. Sounds a little bit different if the therapist is calling versus if the patient's calling to come and join me in my situation. What is your capacity to meet needs across Iowa? Folks, there is an ever-growing need in the church to be able to meet the needs of community members and church member needs as it relates to mental health. And I can tell you today that with my work at the State House around mental health and the policy work that I've been blessed and able to do, and bridging that with what I know is going on in the church communities and in communities across the state of Iowa, the need is huge. So the capacity, we cannot meet all the needs of everybody. If you put all the therapists together today, we could not meet all the needs. So we're constantly looking for good, strong Christian people who say, I want to step into it. I want to create a practice that partners with the church, that equips pastors and leadership to be able to reach their flock even deeper. Just as a sidebar, one of the ways and reasons why God laid this on my heart was initially because of spending many, many hours of journeying alongside of pastors and hearing the pain in not being able to get everybody that they wanted to get to help. And so my mind started churning, my heart started churning with how can I come alongside of the pastor to help equip the saints and relieve some of that load from the pastor and to help them feel secure with turning folks over into someone else's hands. And that's really what this was born out of, was the need and desire to help pastors in churches and church leadership. So a lot of my work today, just so you know, I see a lot of pastors, work with a lot of pastors in counseling. I also do a lot of work with churches around culture and leadership transition, and just looking at the context of church growth and how the church in its entire capacity can continue to meet needs in many different ways. What is your, let's see, we've gotten that one, sorry, let's go to the next one. And how do you see the church being the solution for mental health needs in the state of Iowa? Let me talk to you just a little bit about what I see at the Capitol. And the further that we have gotten from the church being the place and resource for all of those social service needs, the more the state has taken on, the more the taxpayer has taken on, the less effective we become. And I think that's because biblically, when you go back in Scripture, the church community is what handled the widows, the orphans, what handled the needs that were arising within the context of that church community. And if we can build relationship one-on-one, a person at a time, rather than expecting an institution like the state or the institution of government to fix our problems, we change the whole paradigm of what it means to be in relationship. It's now not an institution trying to fix it. It's somebody journeying alongside of me, with me, who's invested in me. Team at Team Restoration Ministries stands for this: trust, energy, authenticity, and motivation. It's our belief at Team Restoration Ministries that every relationship must have trust built into it. And until trust is established and is the foundation, we can't create more energy in that relationship to grow, to engage, to become more transparent or real, or in our words, authentic. That's the A. And the more authentic we are able to become, as that energy builds, more authenticity builds, we are then motivated to go out in all of our full healing to become all that God wants us to do and engage in. So I take that example of what we stand for and believe in and apply that to whether or not government can make that happen for people. I'll let you answer the question. Finally, the last question I see on here today is, how do you see the church, is that the one I just took? How do you see the church being able to be the solution to mental health needs? Yeah, that's the one we were just talking about. So at this time, I don't see, oh, we have some questions over here. Yes. Mind, body, and spirit. Do you have a ministry philosophy or guidance to keep us from making the mistake that a mental health issue is a spiritual issue, etc.? And then how does that interaction of these, such as a sinful addiction, does that interact in the 3 areas? Oh, that is a whole webinar in and of itself. But in a very quick nutshell, let me say it this way. I would suggest to you that the foundation of any person is, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I know this, is their spiritual being. And out of that spiritual being comes everything else around around the mind and around the body. But the church over time, or oftentimes faith has somehow caused us to fall into the belief or the understanding, or maybe it's the privacy of what our culture has around mental health issues, that allows us to assume, as I was talking earlier, that the brain doesn't need the same sort of help that the heart, that the lungs, that the kidneys, that the liver, that many other organs in our body need. And so if we can begin to shift the paradigm and help others understand that our mental health and our brain is an organ that also needs to have attention, and it's okay to take anti-anxieties at times, and I don't push medications quickly, that's kind of a last result, but there are times in which medications have to be utilized in order to help the brain chemistry and the DNA structure in which we inherited from a long family lineage of depression, or of schizophrenia, or of bipolar. So changing that paradigm and understanding it differently, I think, is key. I would also say to you, pastors, what we can tell you is that Team Restoration Ministries, when a pastor stands up on Sunday morning, and in the midst of his message or her message, they talk about the need for help. They talk about their transparency and their walk. Our phones on Monday are very busy because you have now released others to go get help. They now see a model standing before them that says it's okay to receive help. As it relates to the second part of the question around the sinful nature of addiction, understanding the nature of addiction in a very broad, and again, that's a whole nother conversation, but a very broad understanding of how addiction affects the mind, the body, the heart, the brain, especially as it relates to pornography. Those images actually burn. They cross wires. They do the chemical changes to the brain that are very difficult to walk through. So I'll save that for potentially another discussion that we could go through because there's a lot of information there. The final question that I see before us here as we run out of time is, do you have counselors available for young people? And yes, the short answer to that is yes. I will say that with any area of our geography that we serve, each of our therapists are then trained in certain aspects or certain areas of counseling. We may or may not have someone who feels comfortable working with children in your area, but we're always looking for therapists who are willing or can or are trained. And in many cases, in smaller communities, therapists are trained to work in a variety of different settings with a variety of different individuals. But by and large, yes, we do. It just depends on what part of the state and what the area of the expertise of that therapist is. So with that, I believe those are the key areas. I just want to say a good strong thank you to you pastors who really are taking the time to think about this. And with those of you who are on the session today, you will all have a dynamic opportunity and impact to share this with other pastors of, hey, look, this is what I learned about mental health today. Let's have a conversation amongst our ministerial alliance on this. Let's have a conversation amongst pastors within our geographic location of the state within our denomination. Wherever those groups are that you spend time talking to pastors, if you would just take 5 minutes out and talk about a piece that you learned in today's program, that could change the trajectory of how we deal with mental health in the church today. I'm more than happy to come out across the state if my schedule allows to meet and have those conversations as time moves forward. With that, thank you for the work you do. Thank you for standing in the gap with people. Thank you for living for the cause of Jesus Christ. It's been an honor to sit with you all. With that, I'll turn it back over to the other gentleman in the room.
Great, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the beginning of the discussion. We do intend to have a lot more of these conversations. And those who've been following, we have done quite a few equipping series on the pornography issue. That has been one of our top focuses here. If you want to look back at those, check out thefamilyleader.com/combating pornography. And that will continue to be a top focus for us, even going into the Capitol as well, as we try to bring light to that addictive nature. We're so thankful for Joel helping us start this conversation. And please do look forward to more webinars and also equipping days to help us navigate mental health and the needs in each of our communities. Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you next time.